Just how loaded is the Missouri wide receiver room? Let's talk about that and more right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. Got a fun show planned for you today. We're going to talk about another playoff scenario for the Tigers. Would they get in if with a 10-2 regular season and a loss in the SEC championship game? That and many other questions from the listeners and viewers coming up on the program. First, I want to remind you today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. And they've got a great deal for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. And you know what? I think this podcaster might just be taking advantage of that particular deal himself as the huge NFL fan that I am. But of course, we're here to talk about Missouri football today. And a lot of talk in this offseason has been about how the Missouri wide receiver room is absolutely loaded. And I have to agree with that. I really do. And to the point where, well, a lot of people are just hand-waving the fact that Javen Boggs, a top 100 recruit, decommitted from the Tigers recently and is now going to UCF, at least for now. As always with recruiting, and especially Javen Boggs, well, we'll just have to see until the ink is actually dried on the paper. But I thought it would be interesting to take a little bit deeper of a look at this receiver room and maybe a little bit of the skill positions as well, because Missouri is starting 3 seniors this season. Not only Luther Burden, of course, Theo Weiss and Mookie Cooper as well. But so what does that mean? The 2025 offense is going to look a lot different. Of course, this season's offense is going to look pretty similar to 2023. Well, at wide receiver, obviously you lose your 3 starters. Then you're looking probably your number 1 guy. It's going to be a battle, I would say, between Josh Manning and Marquise Johnson at this point. Although I have to say Daniel Blood and Mekhi Miller are certainly going to have their opinions on that particular battle as well. But as it stands here, I think Johnson and Manning, the 2 underclassmen at this point. And by the way, all of these guys are going to be underclassmen next season. Mekhi Miller is the lone exception there. He will be a senior. Blood, Manning, Johnson will all be juniors. Also, Courtney Crutchfield and James Madison. I hope those 2 guys this season, because Missouri's such a senior-laden and experienced group at receiver this season, seems like a perfect opportunity to get Courtney Crutchfield and James Madison, a couple true freshmen. Seems like a perfect opportunity for them to preserve their red shirts this year and have 4 more years of eligibility in the future. So a really good-looking receiver room on paper, just not a ton of guys who are wildly experienced at this point. Though Marquise Johnson in little action has proven to be a very, very, very capable deep threat at the very least. I think he's got more in his bag to develop, and we'll see probably some of that this season. Also, Daniel Blood and Mekhi Miller have certainly had their moments too. Miller in particular had a memorable clutch conversion against Florida, a big-time play. So, and also Donovan Olubade. Speaking of true freshmen, he'll be a true freshman next season. We were hoping he'd be there along with Javen Boggs, but Olubade arguably the better prospect. So a big-time player there as a true freshman for 2025 as well. So to me, one thing to note about that wide receiver room, while not as proven as this year's room, I think there's plenty of depth and talent for 2025 that unless there's just some standout in the portal, I really don't think Missouri needs to go shopping in the transfer portal at receiver. They didn't do it this past offseason. I don't think they're going to need to do it next offseason either. Now, the quarterback position and the running back position, that may be another story. Of course, at quarterback, I've talked quite a bit this summer about how Drew Pine may be the guy. He's, of course, your number 2 quarterback on the roster right now. Sam Horn, of course, the big question mark and wild card at this point, coming off of Tommy John surgery. Then I think your third most obvious option probably is a transfer portal quarterback, some veteran in the portal. How likely that is will come down to just how good Missouri thinks Drew Pine is, and it seems like they like him so far, and of course, well, Sam Horn's health and performance as well. Then, of course, well, I said Sam Horn was a wild card. There's another big wild card you could throw in there too, of course. True freshman Matt Zollers, who is going to be playing his senior year of high school here, starting that up here in the state of Pennsylvania in a little bit. Of course, as a true freshman, for as much as Eli Drinkwitz has relied on experience at the quarterback position so far, I think Zollers, the likelihood of him actually starting as a true freshman isn't zero, but it's pretty darn close. And frankly, if he is starting, that's probably not a great sign for Missouri in 2025. Although, if it is, my goodness, we may have one of the great players of all time in Missouri history if that's the case. Listen, I'm high on Zollers. I think he's got a really high upside. Again, just don't expect him to be the guy in 2025. Now, on the other hand, in the running back room, there could be a younger player who bubbles up like Kejuan Lacey, who is a true freshman this season. It is possible as a sophomore he could take the reins of the job. Jamal Roberts, a veteran, will return, former 4-star recruit in Tavoris Jones, one of the highest-ranked out-of-state recruits Missouri has had in a long, long time, especially until the last couple years or so, was Tavoris Jones. So you wonder, can Jones, a guy who seems like he's been around forever to some of us, but in reality, he's only a sophomore this season. So it is possible that in his junior year, again, as much as Drinkwitz likes experience not only at the quarterback position, but at the running back position as well, maybe Jones is a guy who just needed to bide his time. But again, if none of those guys truly are ready to take the reins, I do think the portal, once again, where Missouri took 2 players out of the portal at running back in Marcus Carroll and Nate Noel this past offseason, I think that's a definite possibility for the Tigers in 2025 as well. So look for the portal at quarterback and maybe running back. Receiver, it just doesn't seem necessary right now. I like the talent, the young talent, and the proven talent that Missouri has, even though it isn't as proven, obviously, as this season. And since I'm on the topic of the running back position here, I want to talk about Cody Sherer just a little bit. Of course, the former Tiger at this point, trying to catch on with the San Francisco 49ers. And one thing I've learned over the years is that talking about former Tigers in the NFL, that topic, well, it just doesn't rate nearly as much, doesn't get nearly as many clicks or views or listens as I would have expected, quite honestly. But I do think Cody Sherer is a bit of an exception there from what I've seen. Without a doubt, the Sherer, despite being the undrafted free agent, well, it seems like there's more interest in him by far than any other Tiger. And that's not an insult to Darius Robinson, for example, the guy who went in the first round to the Arizona Cardinals. I think everybody loves Darius Robinson and recognizes that he's a great guy, for example. And yet, there's just something about Cody Sherer. Again, a guy who came from Truman State and overcame all the odds. Everybody doubted him. And, well, he's in that position once again, an undrafted free agent trying to make it as Christian McCaffrey's backup, probably at best. And so far with the Niners, if you just look at preseason football, if you just look at the stats, nothing very impressive from Cody Sherer so far. 7 carries for 15 yards in this past weekend's game that was nationally televised on Fox. So not a lot happening there, but again, what is San Francisco evaluating here? How is their blocking, that type of deal? How many yards did he actually get before contact in that game? He had one decent run called back by a penalty, that type of deal. So it still seems like, frankly, it's a bit of a long shot for Sherer to make the team, but who can count him out at this point? I certainly won't. Again, I think as good of a landing spot as he could have gotten in San Francisco's outside zone scheme, their run scheme, very similar to what Missouri has done the past couple seasons. He's gotten a lot of praise for veterans like Kyle Juszczyk, all that kind of good stuff. Frankly, if I had to predict right now, I think Sherer it will probably be a practice squad running back. I don't think he's going to make the 53-man, 55-man roster, whatever the number is these days in the NFL. I don't think he's going to be there week one, but I think San Francisco likes him enough to keep him around. So hopefully I'm wrong and Cody Sherer proves me wrong and does make the opening day roster. You can't put anything past that kid, no doubt about that. And coming up, the paranoid portion of the Missouri fan base still keeps concocting scenarios where Missouri can be disappointed and edged out of the college football playoff. So what about 10-2 with a loss in the SEC championship game, getting Missouri to 10-3? What about that scenario? Well, let's talk about that coming up here in just a second. First, though, let's talk about I Bought A, because it's summertime, and that means it's barbecue season. Stock up on all your grilling favorites and earn cash back on every purchase when you use I Bought A. So you won't have to choose between burgers and brats. You can get both, by golly, and the average I Bought A user earns about $256 per year on average. That could cover, well, quite a barbecue party for you and your best friends out there. It's time you join the over 50 million users who use I Bought A to earn cash back every time they shop. Right now, I Bought A is offering our listeners $5 for trying I Bought A by using the code LOCKEDONCollege when you register. Just go to the App Store or Google Play and download the free I Bought A app to start earning cash back and use the code LOCKEDONCollege. That's IBOTTA in the Google Play or App Store and use code LOCKEDONCollege. College football is back, and the Locked On College Football podcast kicks off the action with a live season preview tonight at 6 o'clock Central on the Locked On College 24/7 streaming YouTube channel. This four-part series covers each of the four major conferences, the ACC, Big Ten, Big 12, and SEC, the teams that have a shot in the expanded college football playoff. And yes, I am involved in segment 2 of the SEC preview, so be sure to check out this special streaming on Locked On College's 24/7 YouTube channel or on Amazon Fire TV, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And speaking of your team every day, thank you all every day for frankly giving me some content and some good comments, including this one from Raymond Johnson, who asks, would Mizzou miss the playoffs if they go 10-2 and lose the SEC championship game? Well, honestly, that's a great question. It really is, and not a scenario I've really addressed a whole lot this offseason. I think maybe once or so, a few months ago, so it's worth discussing again. And I think what's important here is you have to reverse engineer this, because on one hand, I've been saying all offseason, hey, 10-2 gets Missouri in. I think 90% of the time, 9-3 ain't going to do it. That's where I've been all offseason. But it's a little different, right? If Missouri, well, they lose another game, let's say they lose to Georgia, who is a one-loss team, or an undefeated Georgia, Missouri loses that game. Well, on one hand, you might think, ooh, that might cause some consternation at the very least. That might cause the Tigers to drop out of the college football playoff. But the thing is, I think you got to reverse engineer that, because what is going to happen there is if Missouri is 10-2 and makes the SEC title game, well, then necessarily that means the Tigers finish second in the SEC. Likely at 10-2, that's probably a tie for second as well. So there'd probably be at least one or two other teams that were 10-2. And if that's the case, we still, by the way, we're a few days from week 0 here. We're about 9 days away from Missouri kicking off. We're exactly 9 days away from Missouri kicking off the season. Still no tiebreakers for the SEC championship game. What in the world is going on here? But regardless, you got to think if Missouri were to win those tiebreakers, whatever they are, and at 10-2 gets their way into the SEC title game, not only does that mean that they were 10-2, obviously, it means they probably beat Alabama. Certainly it means they beat Oklahoma, because there's going to be some sort of, there's going to be a common opponent type thing there. If there's tiebreakers, again, we might have been tied with Alabama at 10-2. Well, that means we would have had to beat the Tide. So again, if Missouri is tied for second in the SEC, even if they lose an extra game there, it's just hard to imagine a scenario where a team that tied for second place in this big 16-team new super conference that has, again, Georgia, Ole Miss, Texas, a bunch of teams that are expected to be real contenders. Of course, Missouri, LSU, and the Crimson Tide as well. Didn't even mention Tennessee and OU and a bunch of other squads. I just don't see any scenario where any team that finishes second in the SEC, by definition, if you lose that title game, I just don't see how you can keep that team out. So, frankly, again, 10-2, I'm sticking with it. Even in that scenario, 10-2, it gets Missouri in the playoff. By the way, an interesting thought and conclusion here from Power Mizzou's Gerard Hamilton this morning. He's talking about Missouri's newest corner, I guess you could say, at least in the rotation, no doubt about that. Nic DeLoach, definitely going to be a part of the three-man rotation at corner. Seems like actually, well, really it's more of a two-man rotation, possibly on one side of the field. Drayden Norwood seems to have one boundary of the field locked down, whereas DeLoach has been trading off with Toriano Pride here in training camp. Well, Gerard Hamilton writes here, during DeLoach's press conference a week or so ago, he said that he enjoys guarding Daniel Blood because it's hard to do. Hamilton continues, Blood is a slot receiver, so if DeLoach at 6 foot and 175 pounds can play the slot and the boundary corner, his role got that much bigger. So I think that's a really smart conclusion and observation there by Gerard Hamilton, and I would just say that means that we have a pretty good idea of how Missouri's probably going to employ their dime package this season. You may remember last season when the Tigers would be on a third and long, obvious passing type of situation, they would often bring Drayden Norwood off the bench to play the boundary, and Ennis Rakestraw would move inside and play slot corner position. So it seems like this year, DeLoach is going to have that Rakestraw type of role, at least in obvious passing situations. Whether he actually beats out Toriano Pride or they rotate or however that works, it seems like at the very least DeLoach is going to have a role on third down. So an important player one way or the other is Nic DeLoach for this coming season. And since I brought up the SEC championship earlier in this segment, I thought I'd take a quick look at the odds over at FanDuel Sportsbook. And it turns out, well, FanDuel is just not all that high on Missouri this season. I'm not saying it's a total insult, but at least compared to the media and the fans and everybody else, it sure seems like FanDuel just not as high on the Tigers. For example, the odds to win the SEC championship game, well, despite being picked to finish sixth in the league by the media, the Tigers tied with Oklahoma for the seventh best odds to win the SEC at 25-1. Tennessee ahead of the Tigers at 16-1, A&M at 14-1, Ole Miss 8-1, LSU 10-1, and of course the Georgia Bulldogs, not surprisingly your favorites at plus 170. So, you know what? How about a little bit more love over at FanDuel Sportsbook? And you've heard me talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, I've got something a little different to talk about. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel at any time. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. So on my last program, I talked quite a bit about my relationship and my dad's relationship with Mizzou sports and Missouri football. Well, viewer Todd Alexander writes, I'm convinced my dad hangs out with me during the football games, even when he isn't among us anymore. Well, Todd, that is a beautiful thought, number one. And number two, I'm convinced that you're 100% right on that particular topic. And you know what? I said my dad and I are addicts of Missouri football and basketball in my previous program, which is, of course, the first step to healing. But on a little bit more of a serious note, one viewer says, I haven't missed a home football Missouri game. Excuse me, let me start that over. I haven't missed a home MU football game since 1979. Season opener of 1980 versus New Mexico. Next week is season opener 44 uninterrupted. All the season where I can't get enough of it. I've said F this many times, and yet here I am. I wanted to sue the football team. They were so bad, I held them responsible for my nasty, out-of-control drinking. They hired Gary Pinkel, and I sobered up and stayed that way. I still feel like a child waiting for his birthday and grandma's money. Kickoff can't get here soon enough. Well, first of all, congratulations on your sobriety. That's very impressive. Good for you. Second of all, totally agree. I feel exactly like it's Christmas morning anytime the first kickoff is here, even if it is Murray State, not the most exciting game in the world. One listener here actually disagreed with me on the importance of conference championship games and thinks I'm probably overreacting a little bit. He says, sometimes this is just a fan of sports, that handle. This could be a he or a she. I'm assuming gender here. Excuse me. But sometimes you have to lose something to gain something. While conference championships won't just mean nothing moving forward, they should naturally lose a little luster since we are trading it in for a college football playoff that includes more teams. I'd rather have it this way than more hope. I'd rather have it this way with more hope for a national championship than only 2 or 4 teams, the way the old BCS or original college football 4-team field was. In those days, yes, all there was basically conference championships and bowl games. Well, indeed, that literally was all there was back in the day, were conference championships and bowl games. And quite honestly, I'm starting to pine more and more for the old days of the BCS, just simply because of the regular season just seemed like it meant more. All the other bowl games certainly seemed like it meant more. And to the idea that the college football the conference championships should lose more luster. Well, why should it? I would challenge that notion, number one. Now, to your personal preference for a college football, an expanded playoff versus the BCS or the 4-team, that's certainly a subjective opinion. That's up to you. I kind of want to see what it looks like, honestly, for one season before I decide if I like it better or not. Call me crazy. Frankly, everybody in charge seems to want to already move on from the 12-teamer and go to a 16-teamer before we've even seen it. I'm not ready to move quite that quickly. So I hear your point there, just a fan of sports. I really do. Certainly, I'm going to be locked in all these 12-team playoff games are probably going to be great. They really are. And there's going to be a bunch of them. It's going to be a lot of fun. Unfortunately, I do think if we lose more than a little bit of luster off of these conference championships, I do think something huge has really been lost there because, frankly, as Gabe DeArmond over at Power Mizzou was talking about a couple days ago, you want teams to have something to play for. It can't just be, hey, I don't know, 10 to 12, 15 teams that feel like they have a realistic somewhat of a shot at a national championship, and then everybody else is just playing for nothing. I feel like that's a little bit silly. Frankly, now that we're down to 4 major conference teams, I think you could consider just doing a 4-team playoff where you have the champions of all 4 conferences. Yes, the Big Ten and the SEC is never going to go for it. They'll cry and say, no, we have more of the best teams. I don't know. To me, that should be the cost of stacking up your conference that much. Just because you can't have both these super conferences, the SEC and the Big Ten, they want to have their cake and eat it too, if you will, to use that old cliche. They want to be able to stuff as many teams into the college football playoff as they possibly can, and yet they still want to keep the SEC championship game, keep it, keep all the money that comes along with it, the big 30 rating that I'm sure that game is going to do most years. They want to keep it all. Well, the problem is, I just think you're going to lose something eventually. So, I don't know. You can't have your cake and eat it too if you're the SEC. To me, the champ should get in, and that's about it. I'm okay with that. Even if that costs Missouri a couple years, I'm okay with it. I really am. But that's just me. We'll see what the 12-team playoff looks like. And as always, I'm certainly loving to hear all of your comments, including this final one here from Larry, who says, like all life forms, the human species is an experiment by nature that is subject to continuous evolution. American college football has been a very minor aspect of this evolution for a very short span of evolutionary time. Here we wring our myopic hands about the fate of college football, while, on a broader scale, we wonder how close we are to a nuclear World War III that bodes to exterminate us all. Well, Larry, that was a nice moment. That was a really nice note to go out on here on the show. The only thing I would say here is that I wouldn't say that I'm being myopic with college football. Being myopic would be looking at all the revenue and the ratings that are happening in the sport right now and saying, hey, everything's fine. It's all systems go. I'm not being myopic at all by trying to look 5 to 10 to 20 years in the future here and say, what does this sport look like if it keeps looking more and more like the NFL? I think that's a fair question. I really do. Now, in terms of World War III and nuclear war, well, that's another podcast for another day. But hey, thanks as always for making Locked On Mizzou your first listen today. Now check out Locked On College Football. Yes, not only the previews, but you want to subscribe on YouTube and wherever you get podcasts to Locked On College Football, so you'll have the national perspective on everything happening every day in the world of college football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So until next time, I'm John Miller, and this has been Locked on Mizzou.